Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hello, Olga. Nice to see you this morning.
Nice to see you too. And welcome former State Senator Debbie Ingram, who is also the executive director of the Vermont Interfaith Alliance.
No, just
Action.
Interfaith Action, yeah.
I wrote that down even.
Yeah, everybody gets
myself.
It wrong. Everybody gets it wrong, don't worry.
Well, so good news, Debbie, the conversation is just going to go down, uphill from here. Can't get worse. So glad you can join us. And we're going to be talking about Proposition 2 today, following up on our conversation last week with Reverend Mark Hughes. So Debbie, thank you for joining us. And I'm curious, one thing I've been sitting with this conversation is that I think for a lot of Vermonters, they know the story, and we love on this show peeling back the stories that we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves a story that we don't have slavery in the Constitution. In fact, we're one of the first states, or as a republic, to outlaw it. And, Reverend Mark Hughes very clearly said, no, that's not the case. So for you, when you started having those conversations around Proposition 2 and the Constitution, did you yourself have to peel away kind of misconceptions or stories around the role of slavery in the Vermont Constitution?
I did. I'm not a native Vermonter, so maybe it was a little bit easier. I think I do find that native Vermonters are extremely proud of being the first state to abolish slavery, and so it wasn't quite as jarring for me, I guess. But I think we're finding all throughout the country in many different ways now that the things that we were taught as young people are not really true. A lot of them, that we were taught all sorts of things that either were incomplete or really deceptive, or painted, frankly, painted white people in a much better light than we deserve to be painted in some instances. So, actually, after a while, I was kind of like, well, this is just another one of those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm curious for you, Emily, when the conversation sort of hit your radar around Proposition 2, what for you did you sit with? Did you have any stories or misconceptions to peel away yourself?
I actually did not know. The first time I learned the history of Vermont's role in both banning slavery, I learned that at the same time that I learned about about Vermont, folks being enslaved in Vermont. Like I learned that history simultaneously. Because when I was in graduate school, I had the privilege of being friends with Amani Whitfield, who I mentioned in our last episode, was really written the history that needed to be told about all of these issues for Vermont. And so I learned that whole story at one time and didn't have anything to unpack. I'm perhaps similar to Debbie, did not grow up here, have, been here my whole adult life, but learn that story early enough on as sort of a complete story. What's been an interesting add-on to it, I think, is partly with the Brattleboro Words Trail and with which sort of and then the African American Heritage Trail that was started down here in Brattleboro by Curtis Reed. I've had some great opportunities to build out my knowledge around folks' theories of our participation in the Underground Railroad and the reality, like we said last episode, probably it was mostly folks hiding booze during Prohibition that all those cute trapdoors came from. And so that's that's been sort of where I came. It wasn't a lot of unpacking. It's been interesting to, through the debate around, and actually it was, at least in the House, not a particularly fiercely debated issue. People felt fairly comfortable voting yes. It's been interesting to have the opportunity to have these conversations as a result of amending the Constitution, conversations that I don't know would have happened otherwise with some of my colleagues who did have more stories to unpack because they had learned something else earlier on.
Mm-hmm. I, of course, grew up in Vermont, as we've talked about on other shows, and I was trying to, in prepping for the show, I was trying to kind of cast back into the Wayback Machine and remember like what I learned and what I felt when this conversation hit my radar. And I think what's interesting for me, I wonder if I would have had a different reaction if I wasn't a journalist. But I remember a moment of, I thought I learned something different. And then just, as a journalist, so often, information starts out one way. And as you dig into it, you find new layers and you find new nuances. So I think that's just where I went next. Like, okay, so what are the nuances here? What are, who were our founders and what did they believe at the time? And who are we now? And what do we believe now? Mm-hmm. And what do we need to know? I think is where I went. But I know for everyone, it wasn't that, it was a big story for a lot of people in my life to unpack. And I think kind of a disappointing story to unpack for a lot of people. Because as you said, Debbie, a lot of Vermonters are very proud of their history. For you, Debbie, the organization you work with, the Vermont Interfaith Action, has been one of the lead organizations on moving Prop 2 forward. What were some of the, was it an easy proposition to move forward? Did it, walk us through that experience?
Sure. So Vermont Interfaith Action is a faith-based community organizing federation. And our congregations actually had a couple of years ago, primarily motivated by the George Floyd horrible killing. They had started to have book studies and discussion groups and intense conversations about systemic racism in our country and racism in Vermont. And so I already had a lot of really highly motivated people in our congregations, and frankly, our congregations reflect Vermont as a whole, so they're mostly white Vermonters. But there were a lot of people who were very motivated to not just do these studies and have these talks, but actually start taking action around racism and social justice. So I had already had 3 groups formed that's how we do our work, is we form organizing committees, and they look carefully and thoroughly at social justice issues, and then our organizers lead them through a process to try to actually make impactful systemic change. And so we had 2 groups working on various aspects of economic opportunities, one on business opportunities, one on housing and land ownership for people of color, and another one working on reimagining public safety. So then when it became time to start looking towards the 2022 election, it was very easy to reach out to those folks and say, is this something that you would like to take on this campaign and try to make sure that this gets passed, so that we can then also use it as a foundation for continuing our systemic racism work into the future. But it'll be a great way to have the conversation with Vermonters all over the state and help them to become more aware of systemic racism and what that's doing to our country and to our state. So it was actually very easy to get the people at VIA on board. And then since then, but we also felt that it was very important to, since we are a white-led and mostly white organization, that we wanted to make sure that we reached out to a Black-led organization. And that's, my relationship with Mark Hughes that you interviewed last week, and the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance was a natural partnership for us. So the entire time we've been working very closely with the RJA, and it's really provided that, I think, appropriate balance for, we don't want to be white saviors. We want to be good white allies and white co-conspirators. And we want to make sure that the maxim, nothing about us without us, is happening for Black Vermonters. And so that it's a Black-led movement also. So we've been navigating that during the whole campaign. And mostly what we're finding actually is a lot of Vermonters just don't know about this proposal. So just in terms of running the campaign more widely, a lot of it has been having conversations with people, either within our volunteers' own networks, personal networks, or we've done a lot of tabling actually at public places, and just called out to people, and folks have been at the Brattleboro Co-op, and we've had people on Church Street in Burlington, and at the farmers market in Barrie, and just asking people, have you even heard of this? And they haven't. A lot of them have not. But we've also been using lots of other organizing techniques and campaigning techniques to get the message out there. But it's been, I think it's really been very rewarding for our organization and for the individuals in our organization, and for our partnership with Vermont Racial Justice Alliance.
I'm curious what what those conversations look like that your members are having. I mean, once someone does hear about the amendment, what do they think? I mean, I was talking to my son about it last week, and he was, supportive, excited, sort of surprised it was still there in the language. And then we got to have a really great conversation about prison labor, which we'd never had before. But where does the conversation go with your members?
Yeah, it varies, but that what you just described with your son happens very frequently. Actually, people, their initial reaction is surprise and shock that, oh, this hasn't been done already. What, this is crazy. I would say the majority of people then from there go, oh, well, of course we have to do this. But there are often questions about, are other states doing this? Why do we need to do that? There is the pushback that we get is more kind of, plantations don't exist anymore. There is no chattel slavery. Why is this necessary? So then we have to talk about the fact that, well, in fact, in our country, slavery has never been completely abolished. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't do it because that was only for the states in rebellion. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has an exception for punishment of a crime. So there's really never been any complete abolition of slavery. So that usually brings people into interesting conversations. Sometimes people talk about prison labor. We don't get that quite as much. We've gotten that more from the media, but we do bring up things like it also has implications for, I think, human trafficking, even for commitment of people with mental health issues. Sometimes people will actually volunteer themselves in order to get support and services, and then the state, depending on how severely mentally ill the state thinks they are, they can have some of their rights taken away. So that actually is another conversation we could have. I mean, it certainly has implications for all kinds of things in our society, but yeah, they are very, very fascinating conversations.
So just for listeners, in case you haven't seen Proposition 2 yet, you'll see it on your ballot, which has probably arrived in your mailbox. So hope you will be voting early. But what Proposition does is it revises the current Constitution to very explicitly prohibit slavery and indentured servitude. I'm curious, Debbie and Emily, as a state, do we have a definition of what slavery is? Like when we talk about, oh, we have all, it could have all these implications. But like, do we actually have a working definition of what slavery is?
I think that's something that the courts will take on. If this amendment passes and certain groups want to use it as a way to challenge some of our current practices, that will actually go through the court system. I'm not aware, maybe Emily is, but I'm not aware of any statutes that exist in Vermont law that actually defines slavery.
I'm not either. And Debbie, that sort of brings me to a question that I'm curious about, which is, one of the interesting things for me as a House member in these constitutional amendments is I never get to mess with them, right? So all of the fun happens in the Senate. So, and again, refresher for listeners, sorry if you already heard me say this 8,000 times, but constitutional amendment starts in the Senate only in certain years. They draft it, they pass it, it comes to the House where we can vote it up or down. We can't amend it. And then in the next, if it passes the House, then in the next biennium, which biennium are 2 years long, different from biannual. Biennium are 2 years long. The next biennium, it gets voted on the Senate, can't be changed, gets voted on again in the House, can't be changed. If it passes in both chambers, then it goes to the governor who has to make a declaration. The declaration says it's going to be on the ballot. It goes to the ballot. That's going to be what we vote on in November. So Debbie, what, I understand that you are the lead sponsor of this amendment in the Senate. What I stay in my own little chamber for the most part, unless there's, I have a bill I sent over. So what did that debate look like and how did the crafting work? Is the language on our ballot the same language that you introduced?
Sorry, there goes my cat. He thinks the Senate is fascinating. Yes, so is, well, actually the language in the that's going into the actual Constitution did change, and there was quite a lot of debate. There was also change of what the purpose of the amendment was for. So yeah, I think when it first, it also goes through, amendments go through the regular committee process. So it was assigned to government operations. And I think at the beginning, I guess there were 5 members of that committee, and only 2 of them really supported it as it was. So there was quite a lot of conversation and discussion, and wound up being multi-partisan support, and we actually had 1 person in the Senate vote against it. But no, it was a long conversation, and Mark Hughes testified, but so did other people. We had, there was a lot of conversation about the historical nature and the historical intent of the original language. There was certainly by historians and lawyers, there was defense of the original language, trying to justify why Vermont has the reputation of being the first state in the Union to abolish slavery. There was, but there were, some of it was so hard to understand and convoluted that I just kept saying, what we're trying to do here is really make sure that there is just plain language, that the straightforward meaning of the plain language to anybody, you shouldn't have to be a legal expert or historian to read our Constitution and understand what it's saying and what values it's propagating. So yeah, but there was a lot. There was quite, and of course we were doing a million other things, too, at the same time. But the committee itself was very representative of the rest of the chamber. So when, here we go again. So when we got it through the committee and they did, vote for it unanimously, I breathed a sigh of relief because I thought, oh, okay, now we're going to be fine because, other people in the Senate will understand that we've resolved these concerns and these arguments, and we'll be able to move ahead.
And was it fairly clear sailing after that?
Yes, as I said, there was just the one senator who voted against it, and he was consistent. He voted against it in the second biennium also, and I understand he's still saying that it doesn't need to be passed. But anyway, that's those folks like him are in the minority for sure.
Mm-hmm. Emily, you said the conversations and the passage of Proposition 2 in the House was fairly easy. But do you remember some of what your fellow reps were sitting with, or questions they had? Or
I mean, there's this interesting, I think, challenge that the proposition has on its journey, which is that it is so overshadowed by a much more controversial constitutional amendment that gets to sit next to it. And so, Debbie, when you said that, a lot of folks haven't heard about it, I imagine a lot of that is because folks are putting so much energy into understanding the Reproductive Liberty Amendment.
mm-hmm.
And so similarly, I think in some ways my memory is, I have a very strong memory of the really endless and divisive and deeply prepped debate on the Reproductive Liberty Amendment, and Proposition 2 sort of paled in comparison in terms of debate. There were certainly, a few folks who made a, historic argument that we shouldn't mess with, we should keep this for the history books. I mean, I think that's why we have history books, though, is to keep the history books.
That's what the historic record's for. Historical record, yeah.
No, that's we have historic records. We have a whole thing called historic records and history
and archives and archivists.
That's what we do for the history books. We have history books. And that, I have trouble in debates like that because sometimes I'm I don't know how to talk about this in a non-blithe way, because that's what it is. And so there was a little bit of that. I think it sort of opened up an opportunity for people to have a small debate on is systemic racism real or not, which, occasionally a member will open up just so that we can all argue about it for a while and then move on. There was some grandstanding. And there was actually I remember the whole thing was opened up with an incredibly moving speech by one of our very few members who's Black, Hal Colston, who represents Winooski and is retiring this year. He's not coming back to the legislature, talking about how important it was for him to see this and to have the Constitution reflect him as a Black man in Vermont feeling free, or wanting to feel free, or deserving to feel free. And I think Hal has a really resonant moral compass when he speaks. Mm-hmm. And he rarely speaks on the floor. And when he does, it really creates sort of a clarion call echo through the chamber. And I think that also really helped the debate move forward in a respectful way, and is yet further evidence of why having a representative House of Representatives makes better policy. Reason number 822. So that's what it looked like in the House.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to get very explicit, because you mentioned a phone call from a constituent, Emily, mm-hmm. asking, what does yes mean? What does no mean? Mm-hmm. So just for the sake of our listeners who haven't circled in their ballots yet, would you walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So on the ballot, in addition to all the people's names with the little bubbles, everyone is also going to have language that I don't have right in front of me right now. I'm sorry. Now I'm wondering.
I think I do.
Put my ballot, actually. Feel a little nervous about that. Thought it was on the desk. So
I have the language if you want me to read it.
That would be great. And then I can explain what a yes and a no means.
Okay. So Article 1 and I'm just going to read right from the state website. All persons born free, their natural rights, slavery, and indentured servitude prohibited. That all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Therefore, slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited.
And so, if you vote yes in that little bubble, it means that you affirm that language and the Constitution. You vote yes, the Constitution should be amended to reflect that new language of prohibition, full prohibition.
Thank you. And Debbie, what do you, we have a few minutes before we need to go to break. What do you want listeners at this point to understand or take away?
Well, that we're making, bottom line here is that we are taking a moral stand. We are saying, and we are asserting as Vermonters that it is in our value system that we declare slavery to be morally reprehensible, and that we think it has no place in our Constitution. And we just want to make that completely clear. So any of the other stuff, the the other ramifications about all kinds of other things, or whether we were the first or what, or whatever, all of that really should just melt away, because what we're doing is we're saying slavery is morally reprehensible and it has no place in our Constitution.
Thank you. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, is going to hear from some of our underwriters, so stay tuned. We will be right back.
Can I grab?
Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser, the regular contributor to this show, and our guest, Debbie Ingram, who is the Executive Director of the Vermont Interfaith Action, as well as a former senator for the state of Vermont. And we have been talking about Proposition 2, which is an amendment to the Constitution to clearly prohibit slavery and indentured servitude, which you will see on your November ballot if you have checked your mailbox lately. Debbie, take us to...
Wait. We forgot an important piece.
Oh, we did. Emily, what do we need to remind people of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guest respectively, and not of the station, nor platform, nor employer of the people speaking, or where it is being broadcast.
Thank you very much. So Debbie, take us to the issue of systemic racism, because in many ways, Proposition 2 is an important step, but it's not the only step we need to take in Vermont to create a more equitable community. Walk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me first just say that I think there's a lot of confusion out there in the conversations that I've had among white people about the difference between overt racism and systemic racism. So I just want to say something about that just a minute. People, everybody, I think every decent human being universally deplores, any kind of hate crime or vandalism or using horrible language, offensive language, from a white person to a black person, having any kind of incidents, person to person, and that is actually overt racism. Some people will confuse that and think that sort of behavior is systemic racism. But when we use the phrase systemic racism, what we're talking about is how our very systems, our institutions are set up to advantage white people over at the expense of black people. So, in housing, white people will have a much better opportunity to rent an apartment or buy a house than a Black person does. In policing, and the criminal justice system, Black people are overly represented according to their proportion in the population than they are in being involved in those systems. In health equity, there's all kinds of data to support all of this too. So lest you think I'm just making this up. There's health equity. Black people have much lower health outcomes, much worse than white people. So in the education, all kinds of systems are they're really stacked against Black people and other people of color. So there was already this last biennium before Proposal 2 started in its way to being passed as amendment. We already had introduced legislation that would address some of these things. We have, Vermonters may not know that we have a terrific director of racial equity. We have a position for that, and the person who fills it happens to be really excellent at her job. And she had, her office had gone through a lot of the statutes and the systems that we have in government, and she had created an omnibus bill to try to address some of the problems there and correct them. That bill didn't get very far. There were other.
Didn't she want to come on the show once, Olga?
She did several years ago. Yep.
When she first was.
Yeah. Which she has. Yeah. And her office also has this really cool new program called the Ideal Program for municipalities. So I would encourage you to have her on again. She's got a lot of good things going on. She also got money to hire another couple of people on staff, so she's able to do some more things. But we'd love to support that office's work more. There was also legislation.
Before you jump to the next thing, what was in that omnibus bill?
Oh gosh, I can't remember all the details now, Emily, I'm afraid. But things like setting up an assessment of legislation that every bill could be run through to make sure that it's actually affecting people equally. There were other things about how programs are administered, about how bids are requests for proposals for bids for state work are issued, all kinds of things to make sure that Black owned or people of color owned businesses are getting a fair shake and things like that. Yeah.
And do you remember how did the omnibus bill make it to committee? Did it make it to either the floor of the House or the Senate? Like, how far through the process did it make it? Do you remember?
I'm pretty sure it got stalled in committee.
Okay.
So there's that. There was another bill about setting up cultural empowerment centers throughout the state that would provide additional supports to people of color owned businesses. There were different things about housing and land ownership. There were one or two bills that affected that. There was a bill about representation on the Vermont Housing Conservation Board.
Let's slow down.
Okay, sorry.
No, nothing to apologize for. I'm just I'm listening to you all of a sudden. I'm like, wait, we should talk about each of those things.
Okay. And before we do, Emily, are these sounding new to you? Like, did they even hit your radar? Or
no? I mean, no, they're not. The omnibus bill was not on my radar, but the idea of having a screener for legislation is certainly on my radar, and I actually developed one for the caucus that works on racial justice issues that we were sort of using internally to screen legislation. I have high hopes for the idea of creating other screeners and staff to support those kinds of other screeners for legislation. It's an ongoing conversation, and with no staff capacity on it, like it needs to be funded within our legislative staff to do something like that, and that's always remarkably controversial, even though those folks work very hard. On land ownership, we actually passed a pretty great bill last year that both created new representation at the Vermont Housing Conservation Board around Black-owned and Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned representation on the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and then VHFA, Vermont Housing Finance Agency, has been working on a bunch of projects to increase land and home ownership in communities of color. And that's really exciting as a result of legislation. Definitely still more to do there. And then there was, what is the other thing you said that I was like, oh, I also remember us diving into that.
The cultural empowerment centers. Yeah.
So I think that's an interest. So Curtis Reed down here, what is that organization called?
The Vermont Partnership for
Fairness and
Fairness and
Yes. They were awarded a contract that came out of a program that passed our Commerce and Economic Development committees on the floor to support, to like provide active support to BIPOC businesses. And they've been sort of issuing regular reports to see how that is actually going. I think it's interesting that that would happen outside of state government rather than within state government. And I think there's much more that needs to happen there.
Well, and there was also a delay. There's a little bit of a snafu about issuing the contract. We understood. So everything got kind of delayed. So that's why it's been put off mostly for the next biennium to resolve. But
that's happening across state government with everything we passed this last year to an extent that's like really fairly horrifying to watch sometimes. And then the cultural ambassador thing, I'm really curious about, when Vermont Racial Justice Alliance opened the Kemp Center in Burlington, it was lauded as like the first community center in the state explicitly for folks of color. And I was really surprised because we've had the Root Social Justice Center down here in Brattleboro for quite a while now that is run by a cooperative of people of color that is very much a community center. And so I think it's really great that we have these like two things at opposite corners of the state. And I'd be curious to see what would happen and what the right framework is for developing more of those.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is, of course, we have I think we have 50,000 people of color in the whole state. Of course, I mean, I know that our state's only got 640,000 people, but still. So yeah, we're really in the early stages of trying to make sure that people of color not only feel that somebody cares, but actually availing themselves of some of these services that we're trying to set up. But then also, I mean, as I talk to other the few people of color who are actually in the legislature, they caution about, again, well-intentioned white people kind of swooping in and saying, oh, here's what we can do. We'll do this for you, rather than, really working with the communities that are directly affected and finding out from them what needs to happen so that there's a long-term, there's also a sustained long-term attempt at reform rather than just a one-off kind of, here, see, now we fixed the problem because we did this one thing, so it's, and it's a perilous walk. And I don't want to criticize anybody because I know my own personal story involves, years of, going to workshops and becoming more aware of white supremacy and white privilege and learning, how my behavior over the years has affected people, and then broadening that to understanding, the systems. And it's a process, right, that we're all going through and that our society is going through. But I think we've got to, and sometimes it's really hard, but we need to stick with it.
And I agree. And I also think it really highlights a very interesting political dynamic that's true in a lot of other areas, but I think particularly true here, which is that, we have the Vermont Outcomes Report that comes out every year, and very few people pay attention to it, but it's basically like data. It's very clear data telling the story of, who and how people are thriving or not thriving in Vermont across a broad range of areas. In the last 2 years, the Government Accountability Committee, we did some really great, I guess that was actually 3 years ago, we did some really great work with Susanna Davis's office to ensure that all of that information was disaggregated by race. And so then we have a very clear story of which are the areas in our state where Vermonters of color are not doing as well as white Vermonters. And from there, we have the opportunity to come up with this, like, what are like strategic root cause solutions to these very explicit data-driven problems, right? But that is like so unsexy and takes a very long time. And in the meantime, you know, Vermonters, for good reason, are like knocking on their legislators' metaphoric doors and saying, like, what are you doing about this problem? So, you know, for me, when I'm sort of like sitting on the Ways and Means Committee, very aware of the racial wealth gap, what can I, like in my, you know, revenues context and tax policy context, do about the racial wealth gap? I do a lot of research on it. What I learn is that the biggest thing I can do about the racial wealth gap is actually change filing status so that people can only file as an individual. You can't have joint family filing. Lots and lots of research at the national and state level that is like one of the most impactful things we can do for the racial wealth gap. That's like a very complex story to tell. Like, none of my colleagues are going to want to do that. Most of them are filing as families and with dependents, not as individuals. Like, it's not like what any, you know, I haven't had any person come to me and say, like, please sponsor this legislation to change this particular thing. Certainly no Black people have knocked on my door to say, please do this for me. And so like that contrast between like the flashy thing that says we think we solved this and like what are systemic solutions to the specific situation in Vermont that we know is difficult. So hard. It's so hard. And
so
like,
hard.
It's so hard. And like, not it's so hard we shouldn't do it, just like it's so hard and we should keep on trucking through that hard thing. And probably we'll have some like flash in the pan, much better use of a lame idiom. Flash in the pan legislation that will make everyone feel good that they got something done. And then we'll have like the slower, longer legislation. And we can't let those quick wins derail us from the longer story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and actually, I mean, if I would bring up like a little bit of a shibboleth, we're using fun words today. That the whole idea about having like a truth and reconciliation committee, that I know that that got a lot of attention, you know, last biennium. But you know, actually, please ask Susanna Davis about that. You know, I mean, that actually may not be the best way to right wrongs. It can also re-injure old hurt, you know, bring up old hurts and re-injure people who've already been terribly damaged. And to what end? What, you know, what's going to come out of that? But does it make white people feel better because it looks like we've really done something big? That may be more, you know, the impact of it. So yeah, we have to keep having these conversations, and it is really hard, Emily. So but good on you for being in the legislature, and keep having them, please.
Thanks. Welcome back anytime, Debbie.
Thanks.
I mean, the Chittenden County voters would have to like weigh in on it too. But
Right.
For you, Debbie, what have been the hard moments for you, and how have you trucked through them?
Well, it really Vermont Interfaith Action belongs to a national network called Faith in Action, and over the last 10 years, we have very intentionally changed the makeup of the people at the top of that of our structures. Our executive director went from being a white man to being a Black man. Executive directors, you know, like my counterparts in other states, are by and large, much more, Latinx or Black or Indigenous, more women are involved, and we've had these gatherings where we've shared our stories, and we've worked with organizations that can help us talk about race and figure things out about race relations. So I mean, I think for me, it has been wonderful to watch, and yet also a little bit uncomfortable to be involved in this. I went from being part of the majority to being, I mean, white people are really a minority now in our network, particularly at my level. And I go to these gatherings, and but now I know what marginalized communities have always felt like, right? If you've been a Black person, you've been the only Black person in a room of a bunch of white people. Now the tables are turned, and that takes some getting used to, and but we're actually listening to one another, and we sure don't always agree. We don't, and then I feel sometimes like, what I'm doing is I'm being a good white person, and I'm trying to help, and I'm making things better. And then, somebody tells me, well, no, actually here are the, here's X, Y, and Z unintended consequences of what you're suggesting. And, don't pat yourself on the back. So it's just, it's really, I think the biggest challenges are just those kind of day-to-day, person-to-person interactions, and interactions within our groups, of just always checking myself, always listening to how I'm impacting other people, and listening to them give me feedback, and it's it's hard, but it's well worth the effort for sure.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the changes that have happened in your national organization. How do I want to put this? I'm trying to give people something, like I think sometimes when we are trying to evolve as a society and change and grow, it can be that growth can be intimidating, and people can back away from it. So this next question is kind of asked in the spirit of kind of the green grass that's on the other side of the fence, when you've worked so hard, and what are you seeing? So as you see your organization go through these changes, what have been some of the benefits of that?
Oh, wow. We've really, we've grown, we've expanded in terms of the numbers of people. I think we also have people who are very, very passionate about these issues, and it's great to see that energy that they bring. And I just think we've gone to kind of a different level in some ways, because I mean, we've always said that in organizing, the first revolution is internal. So people have to come into organizing with this sense of self-reflection and an idea that they want to be part of the solution of really understanding, really grappling with what's wrong in our society, and then passionately wanting to be part of transforming it. And we don't always, some of my folks, they may not be directly affected by affordable housing, for instance. A lot of my folks, they have their own homes. They may be retired from somewhere else. They have more resources. They've never been out on the streets themselves, so they don't have that connection. But with the racial justice work, they've really tried to grapple in a deeper way with their place in society and their place vis-a-vis people of color. And I think that's really, really, really good for our organization as a whole.
Thank you, Debbie Ingram. So we have just about 5 minutes left for the end of the episode, and we've pulled on a lot of threads. So I want to bring this back to Proposition 2 and voting on that in November, and then just touching base again on, like, okay, we've done that, so what's next? Just to kind of summarize a few things. Who wants to go first?
Well, the proposition's on your ballot in November. If the majority of Vermonters vote yes, and I do hope they will, then that's the last step for the Constitution. It is then amended. It is declared amended. And then I guess all those historians and curators we talked about are gonna, have to spend
They have filing to do.
filing to do. Yeah. But after that, it is entirely administrative and filing work to do. And that's really exciting. If folks want to learn more in the lead up to that, and get involved in these local conversations in order to make sure that more Vermonters know what a yes vote means, Debbie, what's the best way for them to get connected? I know down here, our regional organizer is Mike Muricky.
That's right.
That is his paid non-session job, as many of us have those in order to pay our rents or mortgages. It used to be Daniel Quip, if folks remember him doing that work. And most of the churches in the area that I'm in regular touch with, or in regular touch with me, are certainly connected to the Alliance. It's not called an alliance, it's called Action, Vermont Interfaith Action. I really want that to mean alliance, yeah. Debbie.
Glad I'm not the only one who did that this show.
Debbie, what's your website, and like how do people what are other ways for people to get involved in this conversation?
Yeah, our website is viavt.org. Those are V's as in Vermont. And it has a list of activities. Of course, time is getting short. So in terms of the campaign itself, we're doing some phone banking, some door-to-door. We have lawn signs, we have t-shirts, we have people signing pledge cards, we have people tabling at different events. Those will still go on for the next month or so. But in terms of getting involved in VIA longer term, we would love for you to do that. You can really just you can use the contact form on our website. That comes to me. I promise I will respond. I always do. And I will I learned that as a legislator, and I will I'll get in touch with you. And if you live in an area where we already have an organizer, then terrific. But with the power of Zoom now, we have a number of statewide organizing committees. So no matter where you are in the state, we can connect you with other Vermonters who are doing this work with us.
And just out of curiosity, Debbie, you talked about a number of bills that didn't make it through around racial justice, that didn't make it through the last biennium. What are you hoping the legislature will take up first when they return in January?
Well, of course, they have to rewrite everything, right? So it's a total reset. So we're kind of trying to juggle the campaign, but then also looking ahead to the legislative session. And we're certainly going to be working with the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance and Mark Hughes on that. So that's still kind of in process as to what legislation we're going to introduce. We do have this, VIA has had this concept of a moral economy, and that encompasses housing and the way workers are treated. So I'm pretty sure that's where our focus will be, legislation around that for racial, that incorporates racial justice as well.
And thank you. For regular listeners, Stephanie, you from the Public Assets Institute, who is a regular guest on the show, the Public Assets Institute and Vermont Interfaith Action do a lot of collaboration around the moral economy and that story.
Yes.
Thank you. So we are out of time. Debbie Ingram, so glad you could join us today. Emily, if people want to find more information about you, where do they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you will find links to all my social media accounts and other ways to get in touch with me, like my phone number and email address. And I look forward to connecting. There are also a number of really exciting events in the next 2 weeks. So this Sunday at the Latches Theater, we have a film screening and then panel conversation about the Reproductive Liberty Amendment. It's a great opportunity to get all of your questions answered, so you can maybe practice having some of these conversations yourself in your community. We have a reproductive liberty fundraiser the following weekend at the Retreat Farm dance party. Having a community conversation with Lieutenant Governor candidate David Zuckerman on Tuesday to talk about green economy and green building. And so like lots of fun stuff coming up. So please be in touch about it.
Thank you. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 p.m. You can also find us on BCTV. We thank them for all their support, and as well as our Captivate page, and you can find us wherever you find your podcasts. Have a great weekend, everyone.